You are listening to the Marc Guzman Podcast Experience. Okay, so our next topic is San Leandro. So is it possible that San Leandro found the cure to the housing crisis? So what's going on in San Leandro is they have rent control. However, the rent control is one of the most lenient rent controls in the state of California. In fact, you can do rent increases at 7% per year instead of your typical 1, 2, or 3% that most rent control cities have. Now, in 2017, the San Leandro Rent Board made news because they had to cancel 7 or 8 out of their 12 scheduled meetings because they had literally no business. And they had no business because they had no tenants and no landlords filing complaints against each other, and everyone was basically living in peace. Right. And in 2018, they had to cancel maybe not as many as 8, but they canceled, I want to say half of them. They canceled quite a few meetings. And so and again, in 2019, they're canceling meetings again because they simply have nothing to do. So the big question comes into play is, have they found that middle ground where landlords and tenants can be comfortable with a 7% increase?
And again, you kind of hit the nail on the head. That is a middle ground for any time you're in any type of dispute. A settlement arises when both parties hit that middle ground. You have to understand the genesis of rent control to begin with is tenants were tired of having increases of rent at 20% or 30%. And again, these were in cases where the loss to lease was so great, meaning what the landlord can get and what the market would bear. And so when this type of abuse took place, it wasn't a constant, continual abuse. There was a very, when you look at the whole spectrum of the history of rent control or rising rents in the Bay Area, it was literally a little bit of a few years of a blip on the historical chart or timeline. Now that said, because of that, those rent gouging became the face of or the characteristic of a landlord, gouging a poor tenant with rent, so that people looking to do rent control took the other extreme position. And so, when Marc is touching about, or San Leandro is touching about a more moderate ground, that's really what it comes down to, is if there are other places where rent control is at either 10 or 12%, where it's a reasonable number, because most landlords will not raise the rent in excess of 10%. And even my own clients, when we're talking about areas where we can raise the rents 10%, many of them will even question, can the tenants tolerate that? So they are considerate about what's going on with the tenant. It's those instances where a landlord has got their hands tied behind their back. They're being forced to make renovations. Property taxes are going up. Utilities are going up. And they can't do anything to raise the rent or catch up with the cost of living. And it's those two polarized extremes of super low rent, not to exceed 2.85 or 3% or ridiculous CPI numbers. And then the other side where they foresee that it's going to be a super high rent or rent increase. So when you've hit that middle ground, then it becomes something that's tolerable, and it's something that a landlord can or a future developer can calculate out whether or not it's worthwhile to build more housing, as opposed to the threat of being forced to be at 3% or less.
Yeah, and I think when you have the ability to increase rent at 7 to 10%, it really gives that landlord, especially a new landlord, the ability to get the investment caught up to where market is. You may not be able to do it over a 1 to 2 year period, but over a 3, 4, 5 year period, it would be doable at that point, and it makes it a very possibly a good investment to buy. And every city, I feel like many cities have really pushed away a lot of investment within their own city with these rent control laws. There's a lot of people that simply don't want to deal with the regulation, the bureaucracy, the paperwork, and they really just are tired of all this government stepping in and telling them what they can do. And you see a lot of money pulled back from investing in older buildings, older neighborhoods because of rent control. Because new construction is all exempt from rent control, so that doesn't really matter. A lot of developers will just go ahead, build, and their units are exempt from rent control. So it really discourages a lot of people from reinvesting in the city in older buildings, which is not what you want when you have some buildings built in the 20s, 30s, 40s. Those are getting old. Those are very old. And when they're now, I mean, a building built in 1920 is literally 99 years old right now. That's a really old building.
It is, yeah.
And you just don't know the type of upkeep required. So if you have someone who buys a 99-year-old building, the upkeep for plumbing and everything else is just really costly. So I think 7% is that middle ground that they found, and I think we're going to find something very similar with Oregon's 10% rent cap. And I think that's going to be the middle ground for everyone.
So long as you're staying within that 7 to 10% cap, it's a reasonable amount where both parties can be together. It's that time when it's the extreme. It's when you have this polarized set of pro tenant where the landlord is evil and landlord is bad, and so they make it impossible or very, very difficult to be a landlord, and then expect to have more housing and the pricing of rental housing to go down.
Yeah.